I'm not going to sit beside them because, those people are murderers, and literally some of them were. But one of the things that are really important to understand, in situations of conflict, the capacity to differentiate between the past and the present and even the future is disrupted.
I'm Jake Ward, and this is The Rip Current. The Rip Current is a look at the big invisible forces that are pulling on us. And every week we speak to experts in those sorts of forces. This week we're talking about violence and the path to peace. Now, I had a conversation with this week's guest several years ago when I was writing my book, The Loop, and he won't remember very much of it, but many, many portions of it stuck with me. And I've quoted him on a probably weekly basis when it comes to questions of how we get from seemingly endless violence and conflict in the world to real peace, how long that takes, because it turns out it takes a long time, and a lot of the ways in which our assumptions about one another and our assumptions about what motivates one another are fundamentally wrong. And once you get into the conversation that I have with him, you'll see just how much we have to learn about what it is to really understand the roots of violence and what it is to understand the path to peace. The guest is Lord John Alderdice, and his life has been really amazing. He has been the son of a minister, grew up in Northern Ireland. He then went on to be a psychiatrist and a politician. He was one of the architects of the Good Friday Accords that ended the fighting between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. He then became a researcher. He is today both a member of the House of Lords and a researcher who travels the world looking at enormous, intractable, horrible conflicts, sometimes ones with hundreds of years of history behind them, and studies how people might get along. In this conversation, you'll hear his, stories of just how incredibly long it takes, how hard the work is, but how hopeful you can be once you understand what that all is. He also corrects me on the way I misidentify him, because I don't know anything about how British politicians and lords are identified. You'll hear all of that in this conversation, in which I hope you'll see, as I did, that there really may be a path forward to peace. Before we begin the official business, can you please explain to our American audience the honorifics in your name? Because we don't understand that. We don't have that system, and I know they denote two separate things. So can you describe those to us for us? So I know what to call you, and so they understand why you're called that.
So my official title, and folk in America will probably find it rather strange, is Lord Alderdice, or the Lord Alderdice. And this comes out of a historic background where the king, in order to manage those who were powerful, those who owned territory, because if you had territory, you then had tenants. If you had tenants, you had the possibility of a small army, and the king needed to keep all of those kinds of people on side. Some he would give title and land to. Others would have had it long before that particular king came. But when you come into the 20th century, it begins to change. And by the time you come to the period just after the Second World War, first of all, many of the aristocracy had been killed in the First World War and the Second World War because they thought of themselves as the leaders of the people, and they went into the war and they were killed. Mm. And so come just after the Second World War, the principle began to change from being a hereditary principle to being an appointment of people who had a different kind of power in society, people who had knowledge, who had understanding from the professions, academia, the finance industry, and so on and so on. And so it moved then to being a life appointment. And that's the way it has remained. And gradually, those who were hereditary peers have been taken out of the House of Lords. And actually this year, there's a bill already going through which will complete this year, which will remove all of the hereditary peers, all of those who came to the House of Lords because of heredity, all of them will be gone. And it will only be life peers who will be left, people who were appointed on their own credibility, if you like.
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, once upon a time, there was a set of what we would call senators who were a hereditary group.
Correct.
And now we are moving away from that so that only the elected, or in this case appointed, ones are left.
That's exactly right. And you might well say, well, why not elect them all? And there is an argument and discussion about that. I think a few years ago, there was much more belief in the notion that electing people was a good idea. As people in Britain have looked around at some of the people that get elected to positions, whether of chief executive or whether to other senior positions, there's less of a conviction that election is such a sacred way of organising these things. And William Ewart Gladstone, the great Liberal Prime Minister, British Liberal Prime Minister of the end of 19th century, described liberalism as trust of the people qualified by prudence. And so I sometimes joke with my parliamentary colleagues that the House of Commons, where they are all elected, is trust of the people. But the House of Lords, where they're appointed on the basis of their knowledge and understanding, is qualified by prudence.
So when did you join the House of Lords? Right, you don't come from power, as I recall.
Not at all.
You're appointed in theory on your qualifications, right? So tell us that. I mean, you tell us how far, because people will look at this and say, "Oh, who's this guy? Lord John Alderdice, my God, he's clearly lived with a silver spoon in his mouth all his life." But you don't come from that background, right?
Oh, not at all. My father was a Presbyterian minister with no particularly substantial funding and background and no family wealth whatsoever. What happened was I was coming into my teens when things were breaking down into violence, and I wanted to understand why was it that perfectly ordinary, decent people started to do horrible things and say and feel horrible things about other people in the community who came from a different, in our case, different religious background. In other communities, it would be other cultural questions or identity questions or loyalty questions or whatever. But for us, it was largely Protestant Catholic, because Protestants had an identity and a loyalty to Britain, and Catholics in the main had a loyalty and identification with the rest of the island of Ireland.
And Presbyterian is Protestant.
Presbyterian is Protestant, but it's an interesting one because there were two main strands of Protestantism. There's the Anglican community, which is a hierarchical structure that is very much part of the history of England. Presbyterianism is a democratic structure which came from continental Europe, but was very strong in Scotland. And of course, it doesn't have any bishops. Those who are ministers and so are elected by the people. So it's a very democratic structure. And this often created difficulties between these two groups of Protestants. And so often in Irish history, the differentiation would not just be Protestant and Catholic, but Protestant, Catholic, and dissenter. And the dissenters were the Presbyterians. Because they wouldn't necessarily go along with a pro-British line. It depended what they felt was best for them. During my lifetime, that's largely been pro-British.
You grew up where? What city?
I grew up in Northern Ireland. I grew up first part of my life in a little linen village. Then in Belfast for a number of years. And my father was moved to be a minister down in a working class area in Belfast.
And this is what year? This is at the beginning of the Troubles, right?
It's before that, actually. It was in the early 1960s. So I would have been about 6 or 7 years old when we moved there. I was there for 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years, and then moved. My father had come from a country background, and he received a call to a church in a country town, in a farming area, and that was appealing to him, and he thought it was the right thing to do, and we went there. So for most of my growing up period, during which the Troubles started and so on, I was living in a market town in the middle of a rural agricultural area, and therefore for most of that particular period, not exposed to the violence of the city and not exposed to the violence of the border areas either. So it was
because there was true violence going on in both those places.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, there was over a period of a couple of decades or more, there were many thousands of people injured and many hundreds of people killed, shootings, bombings, all sorts of things like that, which is a big thing for a population of 1.5 million people.
And how conscious were you as a child of that going on? How much dinner table conversation touches on that kind of thing when that's happening?
There would have been a lot because my father came originally from a border area, but was quite open to Catholics and relationships with them and so on. And my mother, while she came from a quite strict Protestant Baptist family, she herself was very open and very concerned about the violence that was going on. But having said that, I became very conscious of the divisions in the society, that Catholic kids generally went to Catholic schools. They didn't go to the state schools. They went to Catholic schools. And so I didn't come across very many Catholic kids when I was at the state school. And there would have been a lot of talk. Of course, there was a lot of talk all the time on the television and the radio and so on. And you had to be a little bit wise and careful about where you went and what you did. So I was very conscious of it. And indeed, it was a very motivating question for me. Why was it that this intractable violence not only happened during my lifetime, but had been coming back in waves for hundreds of years, literally, and seemed to be quite intractable. Nobody seemed to be able to find a resolution to it. And I was thinking to myself, why is that? There has to be a better way.
And why is it that, do you think that you're, something about your upbringing or your predilection meant that you weren't identifying with one side or another? You weren't cheering for a team, but you were standing back from the whole match and trying to see it in this larger sense. How do you think you arrived at that kind of remove?
I think a lot of it came from my family background. I think both my parents, for their various different reasons and their own backgrounds, were very tolerant people and very open to people of a different religion or color or background, and felt that as Christian people, that this was a fundamental principle for them. The whole human family, we were all God's children. And everybody had not only the right, but deserved to be treated as a human being. One of the terrible things that we see around the world now, in many places, is groups of people who don't treat others as though they were really human beings, as though they were really proper human beings at all. In fact, some people say, well, they treat them like animals. They don't. They treat people much worse than they would ever treat animals, because, of course, their treatment of them is informed by hatred and anger and fear and a whole bunch of things like that. So I think partly also my father and my grandfather on my mother's side had both come from border areas where they were very familiar with Catholic people, even though they were Protestants. They also came from farming stock, and quite poor farming people, not wealthy big farmers, small farmers. And if you were a small farmer trying to eke out a living on a few acres, you had to depend on your neighbours. You didn't have big machinery to harvest stuff and so on. And so when it would come to harvest time, Protestant and Catholic neighbours had to depend on each other to bring in the harvest and to look after things. Or, if the animals fell sick, you went to somebody who had a bit of expertise in looking after the animals. You didn't have money to go and pay fancy vets and things like that. And if the person who was closest to you, who knew how to look after animals, maybe they were an expert with cows or with sheep or whatever, you went to that person. If that person was a Protestant or a Catholic, that wasn't the question. Any more than you would have said, oh, well, this is a Protestant doctor or a Catholic doctor. You went along to the local people. Now, things changed when the violence broke out again, and people were polarized, and Catholics were driven out of Protestant areas, Protestants were driven out of Catholic areas, and so on. But during the period when they were growing up in a border area, they had a different kind of perception of it, and I think that impacted on us. And I think also, whenever you're kind of coming into your teens, and there's violence breaks out, there's a combination of fear and excitement. You're excited, it's interesting, all these things are happening, and what is this, and so on. At the same time, it's pretty frightening because you get caught up in this, and it's extremely dangerous. And that's a sort of slightly seductive combination or mixture of anxiety and excitement.
Yeah, you're looking for an identity at that age too. You're really looking for who am I and what is my tribe and the rest of it. I'm just sort of astounded that you maintained this somewhat objective perspective on it through that, which then, of course, led you eventually to being, am I right, a psychiatrist. You've become someone who, you were raised in the church, so there's some ministerial tendencies there too.
That's right. Pastoral.
But there's pastoral tendencies, right? But there's something about I don't know, that I think is just very interesting, that at a time when I might have been, proudly wearing the, this or that shirt, or proudly chanting this or that slogan, you weren't pulled in by that.
No, I mean, there is within Irish Presbyterianism, and it's true of Presbyterianism a bit more widely, there are two strands, one of which is relatively conservative, and lives in exactly the kind of way that you were describing. There's another which is much more intellectually questioning, and which produced a classic liberal tradition. And there were, that was the part, I suppose, that I felt I identified most with, this tradition that's always asking, well, why is that? Or how does that come to be? And of course, I was going along to church on Sunday, and then I had the good fortune that at Sunday lunchtime, I was able to argue with the preacher about whether this was really a good sermon, and whether he was right, and was the theology sound, and was it not. My poor mother just wanted us to go and have a nice Sunday lunch, but my father and I would engage, and he liked arguing every bit as much as I did, which was a very good training for politics. And it wasn't that we kind of fell out and so on, but we were able to disagree with each other for the purpose of trying to deepen your understanding of things. Why was it? Why was this going on? And of course, one important aspect, the history. This was a very important part of it. So you would read history. Politics. Well, it was important. Let's read some politics. Let's talk about politics. And I didn't find the politics satisfactory, because the politics, certainly at that time, was saying that people were basically rational, acting in their best socioeconomic and power interests. And I was looking around and I was saying, these people aren't acting in their best interests at all. This is making a mess of everything for everybody. Nobody's benefiting out of this at all. There's some other things going on here. There's some non-rational element which is damaging and harmful. I need to find some people who really understand this non-rational element. Well, that's what psychiatrists do. And that's why I went into medicine and psychiatry and then psychoanalysis, to try to understand it on the basis that if I could understand this better, inevitably in respect of individual people, maybe I could then take that into the society as a whole and understand why whole large groups and communities of people would act in these non-rational and self-damaging ways. And that's basically what I did, and took it into political life.
When we come back, we're going to hear about Sir Lord John Alderdice's role in the Good Friday Accords. Stay with us.
By the way, it's not Sir Lord. It's just
Lord Sir.
No, just Lord.
Just Lord.
Yeah,
Sir is in there though. Sir shows up on the internet.
Yeah, well, sometimes people put it up there, but it's not actually correct. Sir is a knight, and Lord.
I thought you had both. I thought you were somehow
Sir
knighted.
Sir is a lower level thing that doesn't give you anything other than maybe a nice table at a restaurant.
Oh, I love it.
But
Okay.
the Lord gave me a parliamentary seat, which was what I was actually interested in.
I love that. Okay, good. This is great. Because again, people don't know, and I certainly don't know. So this is great.
Why should they? Absolutely.
Okay, so in 1998, you were there at the signing of the Good Friday Accords that officially ended the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And in retrospect, things feel as if they, happened in this rapid cinematic way. But what I recall from earlier conversations with you is that this took a long time. And I wonder if you'd just explain to us a little bit just how long it takes to bring people who are as far apart as those two groups were at a table to try to come to some kind of reasonable accommodation.
Yes. Well, I had, by the time we got to the agreement in 1998, I had been the leader of my party for 11 years. Mm-hmm. So, and before that, of course, I was exploring and interested in trying to see what the possibilities were. But from the point of when I became the leader of the party in 1987, that gave me an opportunity to meet other political leaders in Northern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, in Britain, to meet with Prime Minister Thatcher and the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister Charles Haughey at that time, and to meet with all the subsequent Prime Ministers and Taoiseach, that's to say the Irish Prime Ministers, to first of all try to get a sense of what was the difficulty, why were people behaving in this kind of way, and then ultimately to develop some understanding and build relationships with these various other political leaders so that we could begin to engage in negotiations with each other. The first bit of trying to meet, to devise an understanding of things, to develop that. That took in itself some years. There was a certain curiosity, I think. I was 32 when I became the leader of the Alliance Party. And so somebody like Margaret Thatcher was just a bit curious. Who's this young guy? He's a doctor. What on earth is he doing in Northern Ireland politics? And so surprisingly, she was prepared to meet me at a very early stage, and we were able to sit down and have a conversation.
But as I recall, I mean, you told me once that it took, I can't remember the number, but it took just to understand the seating arrangements took a long time. Do you recall describing this to me, that just the logistics of where everybody's going to sit?
Oh yeah. Well, something of that kind, you have to be very careful, because people have great sensitivities. I'm not going to sit beside them because, those people are murderers, and literally some of them were. So all of that kind of thing, particularly not just during the talks process, because actually there was never a time when everybody sat around the same table in the talks process, which was largely chaired in the later stages by George Mitchell. Because when some people came in, others got up and walked out. They said, we're not going to be in the same place as those people.
You can't even get everybody to sit in one room together.
No, there was never, right up to the Good Friday Agreement, you couldn't get them all to sit in the same place together. Then when we got the agreement, and we had a referendum, and it was passed both in the North and in the South, then part of that was setting up a new assembly. Because what we discovered was the problem was not fundamentally about arrangements and borders and all these kinds of things. The problem was about disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. That was the fundamental problem. All these other things, policing, administration of justice, discrimination, these were all outcomes of the disturbed relationships. So what do
we mean by that? Describe to me, what's a disturbed relationship between historic peoples in that sense? What do we mean?
So first of all, where you have a situation where people are not prepared to engage with each other, to treat each other as human beings, to treat each other in a respectful way, these are disturbed relationships. And sometimes they issue forth in violence against other people for no particular reason other than that they are different and they have different perspectives. That's the first bit. Why historic? Well, historic because all of these things are based on not just the here and now, but on memories of the past, of things that people have done to each other in the past. I remember there's a story about a journalist who came to an area where there was some debate and argument, quite robust argument, about some parades that were taking place. And the journalist said, well, why is all this argument about these things? And the guy who was a Protestant said, well, you see that river over there? Well, the Catholics drowned a whole bunch of Presbyterians in that river. Oh my goodness, he said, that's terrible. I didn't see that on the BBC. When did that happen? And it turned out it happened in the 1600s. But one of the things that are really important to understand, in situations of conflict, the capacity to differentiate between the past and the present and even the future is disrupted. You can find it in people at an individual level. Somebody suffering from dementia, for example. They will speak as though the things they're talking about happened yesterday or are happening now. And they may have happened when they were a child. They will speak about particular people, and actually they've misunderstood. This is not their daughter, this was their mother, or vice versa, whatever. So this capacity to differentiate between past and present and future and different people and groups is disturbed at an individual level when there are psychiatric disorders. It's disturbed at a group level whenever there is cultural and communal disorder. And so whenever people in whether in the Balkans or in other places, in any situation where things are disturbed in the way we've been describing, people will act on things that have happened sometimes hundreds of years before.
Right.
And that's really important when you're talking about politics internationally. For example, when people from the West talk about Hong Kong, they will be thinking about how things are now. The Chinese talk about a century of humiliation, by which they mean how things were when Britain was controlling Hong Kong in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
So how on earth do you get past that? I mean, if you've got people together who are experiencing 600-year-old murders as if they happened this morning, how as a psychiatrist and as a politician do you lead them past that?
One of the things that's really important is to enable people to express both the memories and thoughts and the feelings that are associated with them, and to stick with that and to be listened to by their traditional enemies. Now, it's difficult to get to that point, and it's not purely a question of whether you've got the skills and expertise. It's also to do with the stage in the conflict. So, when people feel in a conflict that one more push, another year or two of struggle, and we can win, it's very difficult to get them to sit down around a table. But I remember Martin McGuinness, one of the leaders of the IRA, whenever we were out doing work subsequently in Iraq, saying what happened for him was that he came to the conclusion, and it was very troubling to him, he came to the conclusion that he was sending out young people in the IRA to be injured, imprisoned, perhaps killed, to no purpose. Why to no purpose? Because he'd come to the conclusion that while the British couldn't beat the IRA couldn't beat the British. And so you were just keeping on year after year after year, sending all these youngsters out to do all this stuff, and it wasn't getting you anywhere, and it wasn't getting them anywhere, wasn't getting anybody anywhere. And once they came to that conclusion, and by the way, senior British generals had been publicly saying exactly the same thing. They'd been saying, look, the IRA can't beat us, and we can continue on doing this for decades, but we cannot beat the IRA. Why? Because it's not fundamentally a military problem. It's a political problem. And so what Martin McGuinness was saying to these folk in Iraq is, fundamentally, you've got a political problem, and there's no military solution to that problem. Ultimately, you've got to sit down and talk. So once people have come to that kind of point, then there is an element of skill and ability and debate and argument and discussion in communities to get people together and arguing about how they'll do it, what shape the table will be, who can be there, who can't be there. So, yes, but there's a fundamental background, which is people recognize. And once you've done that and you start getting them to the table, the key thing to do is to give them the space to speak about these things with feeling. And for them to be heard by their opponent. Let me give you one example. We were all sat round the table. This was at a time before Sinn Féin got involved and so on, but there were nationalist politicians there, unionist politicians, British government, and so on. And one of the leading nationalist politicians sitting at this huge, big round table got really frustrated, and he banged the table, and he said to the British Secretary of State, whose name was Paddy Mayhew, which was interesting, just the very fact that it was Paddy. And he said, Paddy, he says, I don't suppose you know where this table came from. Well, the British Secretary of State, Sir Patrick Mayhew, looked somewhat nonplussed and said, well, no, sir, I don't know where it came from. He said, well, I'll tell you where it came from. He said, I live in South Armagh, and this table came from a castle in South Armagh. And every morning, a young girl would walk past our house and come up to serve at this table. So what he was saying is, what this table means to me is a historic injustice of servitude by a young Catholic girl, as a representative, if you like, of the Catholic community, in service to people like you, Paddy. But there was a funny kind of twist in it, which was, people like you may be called Paddy, but of course you're a Brit.
Right,
you know?
right.
So
that letting loose the emotion of that and being heard by Paddy in this case has this can begin. It can be part of this sort of healing process you're describing.
Yes, as long as the other person listens to it,
takes it in, really takes it in, doesn't dismiss it.
Exactly.
Right.
And you got the sense, actually, when that was happening, you got the sense from everybody around the table, this was not a game. He wasn't play acting. These were genuinely powerful feelings of hurt as much as hate. And when others listened to that and took it into themselves and then found a way of responding, which was not dismissive and disrespectful, but accepting that was a reality. It was not a nice reality, but it was a reality that we have to find a way of containing and dealing with. That's the context. And now, ultimately, you've got to find through that process a way of reaching some kind of agreement. You've been dealing with these disturbed relationships. How are they going to be managed? Now, we identified 3 sets of key relationships. There were others as well, but the three sets of key relationships we identified were between Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, Nationalists within Northern Ireland, but also between North and South, because the people of the South felt very different than the people of the North, even of their co-religionists in the North, for all sorts of historic reasons. But also there was a key relationship between Britain and Ireland. And we had to find ways of exploring those, having around the table for each of these three relationships, each of these three strands of relationships. We had to have the appropriate people. If we're talking about Northern Ireland, it had to be the political representatives of both sides, plus the British government. If we were talking North-South, it had to include the Irish government and their representatives. If we were talking East-West, it was just the two governments and not the Northern Ireland people. And then out of that, and the negotiations, came three institutions which could represent these disturbed relationships: a power-sharing, proportional Northern Ireland Assembly, where whatever the votes you got, whatever the proportion of votes you got, you were represented by that percentage, right up to the level of chief executive. So that if, for example, you were nationalists and represented by 40% or whatever the votes, you would get 40% of the seats, but also you get 40% of the ministerial positions. And at the end, both sides will be represented at the very top. You imagine a situation, for example, where the presidency of the United States has to be a co-presidency between Democrats and Republicans after they've had a war, not in the context of peace. That's the kind of difficulty and the dilemma. And then a North-South institution bringing together politicians on both sides of the border, and the British-Irish, bringing the British and Irish governments together. But it's not really the structures that's the key thing. That's a really important thing. It's the relationships, it's the understanding, the sense of humiliation and disrespect that both sides have imposed on each other, the sense of deep unfairness that people feel about things, and the sense that if we can only find a way of living together, not where we agree about everything, that never happens, but where we can disagree without killing each other.
Yeah.
That's the aim. And that's the point that we got to. And that's what's been able to be sustained now for more than a quarter of a century.
When we come back, we're going to talk with Sir Lord John about the work that he's done all around the world, looking not just at the Northern Ireland conflict, but at conflicts between endless numbers of people and everything he's learned from that. Stay with us. When you imagine, so I like to use a device to try to sort of understand things. If extraterrestrials landed on Earth and they looked across all of the conflict that we have, which, as I'm sure you'll be able to explain better than I, is endless right now, and you were to try to explain to them how long it takes on average to try to come to the kind of conversation and peace agreement that you managed to help engineer in Northern Ireland. How long does it take? I mean, it took you, 11 years to get through to that. Should we be setting aside at least a decade of what you're describing to get to the end of some of these conflicts?
Well, the first thing to say is ending a period of violence does not itself always have to take such a long time. You can get to ceasefires and so on. But of course, that's not the end of the fighting, because you can have a ceasefire and then people return to the violence because you haven't made sufficient political progress. So it's important. And making the political progress is the bit that probably takes the most time. But ending the violence is a critical prerequisite for that. But when you say how long does it take, I remember when Jean Kennedy Smith, the sister of Ted Kennedy, was appointed ambassador to Ireland. She asked to meet with me, and we met and we had a bit of a chat. And then at one point she said to me, well, how long is it going to take to resolve this, to sort this problem out? And I said, well, it's so far this particular phase of the Troubles has been going on for about 25 years. So my rule of thumb as a psychiatrist would be it tends to take you as long to get out of a problem as it took you to get into a problem. So, we're probably talking 25 or 30 years. And she said, well, it can't take that long. And I said, well, why not, Ambassador? And she says, because I won't be here then. And I said, well, I don't think that's part of the IRA's calculus, to be quite honest.
I mean, this is the problem that we face in our world, right? Is that the big political moves that need to be made take longer than a single administration or
Absolutely.
somebody's term in parliament or whatever it is. And as people say endlessly, you can't run on imaginary results 20 years out. That's not the record you run on.
Well, that's right. But there's an important point here. First of all, statesmanship and being a politician aren't necessarily the same thing.
Right.
And there are politicians in every generation who can see beyond their mandate. In Ireland, for example, and not talking about the conflict here, but there was a Taoiseach called Sean Lemass in the 1960s. And he looked at the situation in the southern part of Ireland. And he said, we're never going to get anywhere without a better educational system for our kids. And so we're going to put money into that, and we're going to develop a better educational system. And that's what he did. Now, he was perfectly aware that it takes decades to reap the benefits of a better education system. He was never going to see it as Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, but he knew it was the best thing for his people and his country. And he was absolutely right. And indeed, long after he was gone, the country began to reap the benefits of that educational system and improvement that he'd put in place. And there are people in politics who are prepared to see things in the bigger picture. And it's very important to do. The second thing is that you can get to a place where instead of political parties saying, we're going to undermine what the government are doing because we're the opposition and they're the government, you can actually sometimes get beyond that to parties acting in the national interest. So, for example, in both Britain and Ireland, during that whole long period, which was actually much longer than 11 years in the end, they became national questions, so that whether it was a conservative government under Margaret Thatcher or much later a Labour government under Tony Blair or a conservative government under John Major, or in the Republic of Ireland, whether it was Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or a coalition or whatever, the issue of the peace process was regarded as one that transcended party politics. I don't by that mean that they never disagreed, of course, but they would do it in a thoughtful way and in a constructive way, and the purpose was not to pull the other guy down. The purpose was to actually genuinely improve the process. That's something that does not happen so much in some jurisdictions at certain periods of time. And
You're being very polite, but I will say, as an American, I don't recognize what you are describing. That is not something that is not part of our thing right now. No one's talking. I mean, they all talk about higher principles, but that's not what anybody's about. It's all about winning. Right?
You're completely right. And actually, I noticed that as a deterioration in American politics over my lifetime. I mean, in the early days when I was going backwards and forwards and we were talking with people with different backgrounds, there were Republicans who were to the left of some Democrats and some Democrats who were to the right of some Republicans, and people would work across the aisle, as you say in your part of the world. But I noticed over a period of time that began to dissolve, and it is not in the best interests of the country because people are then fighting and feuding over their own selfish advantage. And it's not even a well-informed, educated self-advantage, because the betterment of your country in the end is the betterment of your children and your grandchildren. But you're right, in the United States at this juncture, things have deteriorated. And it's not where you're at, and it's not where the world is at the moment. The institutions that came out of the Second World War are dissolving in front of our eyes. And that is not good news. It really is very, very serious indeed. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. You went on to, you've had a career in politics, but you have also had a career, and you've had a career as a psychiatrist, but you've also had a career now as a conflict researcher. Am I characterizing that correctly? Like you fly all over the world and do research on enormous, deeply entrenched conflict. Tell us about that. What is the, and give us a couple of the sort of let's talk about some conflicts that have caught your eye that have been particularly meaningful to you, and then some lessons that you've learned from them and how you stitch them together with the rest of your experiences.
Sure. So one very obvious extension of my own work was, if it was necessary to talk with the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries, to realize that you could have a political process without involving the people who were doing the violence, but you couldn't have a peace process unless you started engaging with the people who were doing the violence and help them to find a way out of the violence. Then one area that I was obviously very interested in then was in the Middle East, the whole Israel-Palestine problem. And so what was the read across? Well, if I had to speak with the IRA and the loyalist paramilitaries, then I needed to go and speak with Hamas and Hezbollah and Jewish settlers and so on. And I started to do that. But here's
this is what era? What era are we in?
Oh, this is in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And indeed, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister at the time. He was very interested. He asked to see me. I used to come and speak to him in Downing Street and talk about the people I was meeting and what we were doing and so on. But here's where the problem came. In Northern Ireland, we had a British government in particular who came to the point of saying, we can't win here, therefore we're going to have to take a different approach. And then publicly said, please understand, we no longer have any selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. We simply want a peaceful outcome. And whatever can be agreed amongst the people there, we will support it, even if it's not immediately in our interests. Because ultimately it is in our interests and everybody's best interests to not have killing going on. But the problem is when I started doing this work in the Middle East, although I could meet with these people and I could address the same questions to them as John Hume addressed to the IRA. John Hume said to the IRA, if there was a way other than violence, would you be prepared to explore it? And he said, of course. Well, we only do this because we don't see another way. So when I met with Hamas, I said the same thing. And they said, they gave exactly the same answer. They said, we don't find any way that anybody will take any account of us. That's why we do this. If there was another way, of course we would. But we don't believe that anybody's prepared to listen to us. And the problem that arose was that I discovered that when we did start to make some progress in addressing these kinds of things, when, for example, Hezbollah came to me and said, you did some stuff of decommissioning of weapons. We would like to know how you did that, because there's a lot of pressure on us to get rid of weapons, and we want to understand how and why. And so I wrote them a paper. I sent it. They said, we've read your paper. We want to talk some more to you. And we had some conversations. But what became very clear was that the United States, Israel, and indeed Britain were not actually interested in a peace process in the Middle East. They wanted to win. That was the thing. They wanted to win. And as I said earlier on, when people are still in the mood for one more heave, or we can win, or we're not going to allow those guys to get anything out of this, then it doesn't work. And so I found that I had to withdraw from the process because I couldn't bring anything to the process if Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom were not prepared to engage in a peace process. They simply wanted victory. And so I went off to other parts of the world. But of course, and it was much later that I went back, and that's a whole other story. But what did we find in the research work that we were doing in this? Well, I'll give you an example. We started with, for example, in the Middle East, we started to ask a number of questions. For example, of Palestinians, we would say to them, well, now look, you're not going to get the right of return. You want to return to your areas that you were driven out of. You're not going to get that, but you're going to get money. What's your reaction? And the answer was anger. Then we said, well, you're not going to get right of return, but you're going to get a shed load of money. What's your reaction? Much greater anger.
Wow. Now that's interesting.
Indeed. And then we said, you're not going to get right of return, but Israel's going to say, we appreciate that you have been harmed and hurt by this. And the response was, that's the basis for a conversation.
Wow.
Now, when my colleagues took that to the National Security Council in Washington, D.C., they said, much like what you've said, that's impossible. You've got it wrong. You don't understand. And of course, the point was, the people in Washington did not understand how people feel. Why? Well, let me transpose it to something that might be more familiar to an American. You say, okay, that's a very nice car that you've got. And the colleague says, oh, yes, it is a nice car. I say, well, I'll give you $20,000 for it. You say, well, I think it's worth more than that. You say, okay, I'll give you $50,000 for it. Done. And then you say, that's a very nice wife that you have there. I'll give you $20,000 for her. And you say, don't be absurd. You say, okay, I'll give you $50,000. And then you get a whack on the face. You say, what kind of a person do you think I am that it's all about money for my wife? Now, maybe there are some Americans who would do that. But in the main, people of any dignity and humanity will say, my kids are not for sale.
Right.
My
right.
partner's not for sale. My country's not for sale. There are those things that are not able to be measured in financial terms. And what the Palestinians were saying was exactly that. And they were saying, and by doubling the amount of money, what you're saying to me is, you think we can be bought, that we are mercenary. We're not. This is in ours. This is of huge importance and significance to us, not about money. And of course, you know, we've seen that in the last little while, even in that region, that people thinking, well, you know, why don't you move somewhere else and we'll do this and this and this.
Right, we'll pay you to make this beautiful beachfront property into hotels and the rest of it. Right.
Exactly.
Nothing more inflaming, according to
right.
what you're describing here.
That's exactly right. It makes people absolutely determined. We will die here before we will accept that kind of proposition. And this is a not unnatural proposition for people that they will respond in that kind of way. And you see it all over the place. So that's an example. Now, here's another example of some of the research. So we started doing work with young people, and the research work was largely being done in Spain, where there were, you know, bright, young, ordinary students and from stable family backgrounds. But there were also some young people who were heading off to be suicide bombers, right? And so my colleagues took some of these two sets of young people, same kind of age and so on, but with very different attitudes, and put them into magnetic resonance imaging machinery and did functional magnetic resonance imaging of their brains as they were being asked questions about these kinds of issues. And here's the thing that was interesting. With those who were operating under a normal cost-benefit analysis, if you like, you know, is it worth it for me to do this and this and this? Certain parts of their brain would light up. But the young people who were giving a different response and who were saying, I know I might die, I know it might become, but this is right, this is important, this is more important than my life. It was a different part of their brain that was lighting up. In other words, it's not just psychology in some simplistic sense. The part of the brain that operates with these young people is a different part of the brain. Young people particularly, but also older people, who are living in a situation of existential threat, of all that's important to them is being dismissed and disregarded. A different part of their brain operates that does not weigh things up in terms of cost-benefit analysis.
You're speaking to an entirely different person than you think you are.
Correct.
It's not the conversation about the car. It's the conversation about something else. And you got to recognize this is a totally different set of circuits being activated here.
Exactly. And I'll give you another example, not from a situation of profound violent conflict, but of the United Kingdom and a debate that was going on between the Scots and the rest of the United Kingdom about independence. And over a period of time, there were all sorts of arguments about whether it was in the best social interests of the Scots to go independent and all of this kind of people were saying, no, you know, it's going to cost a lot of money and you're not going to be as well off and there'll be no health service, all this kind of stuff. And it got absolutely nowhere. The opinion polls were showing that the Scots weren't taking any heed of it until the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, said, of course you have the right to go independent. You have the right to vote under. You know, we would be very sad. We would really miss you as part of our United Kingdom. And suddenly people began to feel, oh, there's actually some sort of relationship there. There's some little bit of warmth that we never realized was there. And in the end, the referendum was not passed, and independence
That's incredible.
did not come up.
It's so amazing, right? Because against all, you know, the logistics, the studies, the economic evaluations, it doesn't matter. We will miss you, turns out to carry the day. That's incredible.
That's right. That's right. Huh. And another example of an intervention that David Cameron made, he made very many mistakes, but another important intervention, there had been a riot which had, the British soldiers had opened fire, they'd killed a whole bunch of Catholics way back in the early days of the Troubles. And there'd been all sorts of investigations and inquiries that had said that they were justified and so on. But the people in the area never accepted, the Catholic people in particular, never accepted it. And David Cameron was presented with a report then subsequently. It was after yet another investigation, which basically said, that the British soldiers were not justified in opening fire at all, and they killed these people, and that it was just wrong. And David Cameron saw the report, and I'm sure he had lots of advice from civil service and all sorts of press advisors and so on. That this is the way to couch it, this is the way to spin it, and so on. And he didn't do that. He made it clear he was going to make a public announcement. People got together. For example, in Derry, they had huge big television screens so that people outside could see it. And he came on and he said, what happened was absolutely wrong. And on behalf of the United Kingdom, I want to apologise unreservedly for it. And he made it clear there was no ifs, buts, no excuses. It was simply wrong. And it should not have happened. And he, as the British Prime Minister, even though it didn't happen on his watch, he, as the British Prime Minister, was going to apologise profoundly for that. And there were Republicans standing there with tears coming down their cheeks.
People, I mean, it's funny, I literally talk to my kids once a week about the power of a really good apology.
Yes.
And how important that winds up being. It's incredible that it works on an individual basis all the way up to a public speech like David Cameron made.
But it has to be genuine.
Right. You got to feel it. You got to feel it and really deliver it. And like you say, it can't, I mean, it's funny. Anybody who's received a bad apology knows the difference between right and between good and bad.
That's right.
When we come back in our final segment, we'll talk about some of the misconceptions that I held until I first spoke with Lord Alderdice. Stay with us. When you and I spoke many years ago for my book, The Loop, I remember you sort of dispelling a myth, really, that I had in my mind that had to do with the degree to which human beings, can tolerate difference in one another. And I sort of, grew up in very multicultural environments. I grew up typically in very diverse cities, and so I think I grew up with a very specific set of sort of expectations about the value of, the importance of diversity, the benefits of diversity, basically. But you have done research all over the world that suggests to you that is not normal, that is not how most people end up feeling, especially in this moment where there's all this controversy around diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and diversity has become this watchword for something else. Tell us a little bit about those findings.
Well, it's a very complex business, because when, for example, people say, well, describe, as you have, the society that they live in, where all of these differences are accepted, welcomed, and so on. What they often don't understand is that is a particular culture and perspective in itself. And that there are other people who have a different culture and perspective and set of beliefs that says, well, actually, no, we don't see things in that kind of way at all. We feel, for example, whether for religious reasons or political reasons or cultural reasons, we want to live in a different kind of way. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin said, the problem is there is no agreement on the good. People from different backgrounds and so on have a very different perspective and a different way of being in the world. For example, in the United States, one of the great driving ideas is of the individual.
Sure.
Individual is crucial.
Yep.
And indeed, many young people would be told that the important thing for you is to fulfill yourself and not to allow anybody else to stand in the way of you satisfying your requirements and your needs and your wishes and your ambitions. That's the key thing.
Sure.
There are other communities that say, well, that's all very well. But what happens then whenever people come into conflict? You've got a different set of wishes, a different set of ambitions. So our view would be, say they, that actually the community is the important thing. Right. Because if the community doesn't survive, then none of us survive. Individuals may come and go. Indeed, we actually expect individuals to go and sacrifice themselves for the sake of the community. If you don't have that...
This is the subtext of political speech in China, right? American political speech is all about individualism and the right to live life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and the rest of it. Whereas in China, it's all stability and community and the rest of it. And for me, as a tech correspondent, I'm always very interested in the ways in which you have technology being developed in parallel in both of those societies. But here, the idea is that the technology should be as free and open as possible so that you can be as expressive and exploratory as you like with it. Whereas in China, it's all about centralizing, rhetoric and centralizing perspective and monitoring what people you're making sure no one's getting out of control and the rest of it. But same technology, but different values.
Absolutely. And also, both sides are closing their eyes to something important, because in the United States, one might say, well, everybody should have the right to this and this and this. But actually, you find that if you don't happen to agree with those notions of diversity, suddenly your rights are a great deal less, and you'll be platformed, or you'll be sent to go. And on the other hand, in China, where it's all about the group and the community, on the other hand, leading people are often more equal than the rest. They have greater benefits. So each side looks at it from their own perspective and blots out the alternative perspective so that they can't see it. And so one of the things, for example, in Europe, because we have different cultures and languages and countries and so on, who are living cheek by jowl and have the experience of killing each other a lot of times.
Sure.
And they know, well, actually, we need to find a way of living together, but we're going to be a bit different, and we have to accept a degree of difference and without getting into violence about it. That's another very different perspective, which is why, although people look at the United States and Europe and say, well, they're all the same, well, they're not actually.
No.
They see things in a very different way.
Yeah.
And of course, even between Canada and the United States, the differences in perspective there have suddenly emerged in a way that people wouldn't have recognized a few years ago.
I think one of the biggest problems that we sort of have on the world stage is that the United States doesn't really have, we're such a young nation, we don't really have a set of, values in the way that you are describing that any two Americans could come together over, whereas Canadians, could ascribe to something like that. What's that joke about Europe? The European version of heaven is the mechanics are German, the lovers are Italian, the cooks are French, the policemen are British, and the Swiss run everything. And then, right, and hell is the mechanics are Italian, the lovers are Swiss, the policemen are German, the cooks are British, and the French run everything, I think, or maybe the Italians run everything. Anyway, but you're
exactly.
as offensive as that may be to certain people, it is at least sort of there's this accepted. Any European you tell that joke to will laugh.
Yes,
because they recognize something about the national character of each place.
And also about the fact that we can live together with different roles.
Yeah, you can have different roles. That's exactly right. But in the United States, the problem with us being the great geopolitical force that we are is we don't, I feel like, we're not a mature enough nation to know how to accommodate that kind of difference, other than to say, well, everyone should just be, left to their own devices, or whoever wins the popular vote wins, right? We don't know how to accommodate difference, it feels to me, in the way that much older societies have learned to.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, and it seems to me that would be a very important focus of reflection as to why that is.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are those who will say that racism and so on are really very important in this regard, and indeed they are important things.
I would say that. Yep.
But there's a complexity there too, which is that, yes, those who have been treated badly in the past on the basis of color and indeed culture and so on, when they have the opportunity to come out of that in a legal sense with civil rights and so on, they may not find it at all easy to come out of that. In the same kind of way as a person who grew up in a family where they were abused and so on will very often end up abusing other people or abusing themselves, because it's actually right into the whole way of perceiving things. And I think one of the things that is a great struggle for someone in those circumstances is to actually muster up the kind of initiative to change
Yeah, the magnanimity to look beyond your own experience. My dad, who's a historian of colonialism and slavery, the point he makes over and over and over again is when people have been brutalized, they go on to be brutal. Yes. It is not ennobling to be brutalized. It does not create noble instincts in
Absolutely.
people.
And that's why whenever people look at what's happening, for example, in the Middle East at the moment, and they say, well, for goodness sake, if there was any group of people that realize how awful it is to be treated in a way, it must be those who have experienced it in the past. Yeah, but we're more complex than that. And
and what lesson would you really have learned if you were if you were institutionally persecuted, if you were the victim of genocide? What lesson would you have learned? I don't think it would be to be more tolerant of everybody.
It's very difficult and complex. We are not wholly rational beings. We are hugely impacted by our past, but somebody else can't of themselves get us out of that past. We can cooperate together, we can work together, but it's not the case that somebody else can take us out of that past. We ourselves have to make the effort. And I remember in terms of the politics, for example, I talked to, as you said, people from all sorts of different kinds of backgrounds who are in these sorts of difficulties. And you'll very often find that they will talk endlessly about what everybody else has to do to sort their problem out. And I say to them, you know something? Hell will freeze over before those people who have the advantage give it up for your benefit. It's just not going to happen. And one of the things that happened in Ireland was that Republicans, Irish Republicans, very different from American Republicans, sure. Irish Republicans recognized that. And they began to say, you know what, we need to change our approach if we're going to get out of this situation. There's no point in expecting that the Brits are going to sort it out for us. They won't. Why should they? It's not their, they're benefiting from it. Why should they change it? We need to change our approach, not to allow ourselves to be trapped in the past that we inherited and find another way of doing things. Now, there's no magic potion for that. There is no trigger that you can flick for that. Some communities will be able to recognize that and do something about it, and some communities won't. We have to do our best to understand it. We have to do our best to learn from these things. And I suppose that's one of the drivers for me now, as I'm an old greybeard, is to say, well, we did learn a few things. We didn't learn everything, but we learned a few things. We were fortunate. We were living at a time whenever other world leaders regarded themselves as leaders because they resolved conflict. At the moment, many world leaders think they're leaders because they conduct conflict. So this is not a very good time. We lived in a better time. But we must give ourselves as best possible to understanding these things at every level, psychologically, sociologically, politically, biochemically, biologically. Bring together whatever knowledge we can and understanding we can. And ultimately to realize that what it's about is being human beings treating other human beings as human beings. That's what it's about. It's about disturbed historic relationships and how we get beyond them into better relationships. And of course, AI may help us in some things and hinder us on others. Sure. Our history too can help us and hinder us. But as human beings, we will either find a way of resolving this together, or all of us will not just suffer, but could bring our whole race to an end, either through nuclear holocaust or environmental catastrophe. Unless we find a way of living and working and dealing with these disturbed relationships. And I'm not without hope that we can do it. But I also realize the danger that we might not do it.
Lord John Alderdice, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
It's been lovely to have the conversation, Jake.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.